Hello and welcome to larp. I have not been very active last year because due to the pandemic there hasn't been any larps, and without larps I have not been motivated to build anything. Sorry about that. But I had a lot of free time on my hand, so I did a lot on my other YouTube channel, Let's Seba, which is more focused on everything besides LARP I'm doing, mostly tabletop RPG. So if that is interesting to you, please check out my other channel, link in the description below. But maybe this year we'll have LARP again. So I've been building a leather sheath or scabbard for swords. Now there's a number of ways to go about it. I've seen some great constructions using a laminating technique with linen and wood glue, and also with glass fiber and epoxy. But I think that is a bit involved technique, takes a long time. You can make it just out of thick leather and maybe harden that with hot water. That works perfectly fine, but thick leather is an expensive material to get a hold of. So I've been experimenting with thin leather. Initially I did this. This is thin leather over a core of PVC flooring, and this is actually a very sturdy construction, but I thought this came out too thick. Maybe could have shaved off a few millimeters here. This is supposed to go with this here knife. But as you can see, there's no millimeters to spare. So I tried something else. This is very thin leather, and it's just hardened with a hot air gun and a mixture of beeswax and canauber wax. The same I used for hardening my leather bracers. And as you can see, this is a lot sleeker than the other one. And it also fits the knife better. So I worked on that concept and I made a prototype. This is the sword prototype. What I did here, for the mouthpiece, I wrapped leather bands around it, leather cord, and I fixed it with wood glue, which became like a leather wood glue composite material. Fairly sturdy. I think looks pretty good. Did that on the bottom as well. And this fits my kind of big Viking sword, though it's a tight fit. And I put belt in here, just with 2 straps. You can pull through and then knot off. This holds your sword ready to go. Would be period correct for around 10th century Viking era. But a friend of mine wanted to have something with a bit more panache, so I did this brass mouthpiece here, which was a pain to get on. The overall shape of this sheath is pretty pleasing, I think. And it's got a universal kind of mount you can put on any belt. And this one fits the blade really well. Slides in and out easy. So if you want to see how I built this, stay tuned and I will show you exactly how I made this. Step 1. Cut the leather for the sheath. To do that, I measure the circumference the sheath should have, and for that I make I make a loop in my measuring band and tighten it to a point where it can still slide easily over the sword, and give it about a centimeter so you can sew it together. It's just the point where you pinch the band together, and for this sword it turned out to be 16 centimeters. I've already squared off a piece from my leather. This is about 1 millimeter thick cow leather that I got a great deal on eBay for. After transferring that to the leather, you can easily figure out how long it is. Make it a bit longer than it needs to be, because it will shrink a bit when we're hardening this later. You don't want to be the sheath to be too short at that point, which happened with the first one I made. Cut it with a carpet knife. Check if it fits like intended. And using my big ass tailor's scissors, I round off the tip. Also need a small piece of leather so I can sew on a kind of loop for the mount of the sheath to go through to keep it in place. You could sew all of this together by hand or with a hand sewing tool. I showed how to do that in how to make a leather knife sheath, but that takes a long time, and I've got this super heavy duty leather sewing machine, so I'm sewing this on by machine, and I'm starting with this loop. This is as far to one side as it can go, because my friend wanted to have the seam on the back of the scabbard, so it's not visible. That means if I want this loop to be at the center of the back of the scabbard, it needs to be as close to the seam as possible. This would be easier to center if I could do the seam on the front. Just sew this on with little squares at the top and the bottom of the loop, and make sure your stitches are secured. I like to just knot together the ends of the thread. And then it's time to sew the sheath together. Just fold it and make a simple linear stitch along the side. I want it to be the seam, the edges of the leather to be inside of the sheath. So I've sewn it together inside out. So I have to pull it around, put the outside on the outside. And I do that with the help of a broom handle where I can pull it over like whatever. And get the outside on the outside. Now it's time to harden the leather. And I start by wrapping the sword in cellophane foil to keep it from sticking to the inside of the sheath, to keep it protected. Also, once it is completely wrapped, I put some talcum powder on it to make it non-sticky. But to begin with, I put a piece of wood into the sheath to keep it inflated, because I don't want to risk burning the foam sword with the hot air gun. This is a mixture of 50% beeswax and 50% carnauba wax left over from hardening some leather bracers. And I just heat up the wax, heat up the leather, and make sure that everything, every part of the sheath is good and soaked with the wax. Once every part is really soaked in the wax, I use the air gun to heat up the leather to hardening temperature and make it soak up all residue. And it's time to pull out the wood and put the wrapped sword in there before the wax cools down and the leather will be fixed in place. It won't become super hard, at least not with the amount of heat I was putting into it, but it became hard enough to stay in form. So put the sword in and then I weigh it down just a bit to press it flat onto the sword. Once it has cooled down, you can get off the whites, takes only about 10 minutes, take out the sword, and that finishes the initial forming process. So it's staying in shape, but it's not super hard. It's still flexible. And should it get squished and damaged during use, you can just reapply the heat, reapply the wax, and get it back into shape. Now this is already serviceable, but I want to have a good looking mouthpiece. And you could wrap that with leather band and wood glue like I did for mine, or maybe even cord and wood glue, which would be historical for a Viking sheath. But this one I made with nice and shiny brass. So I've got a 1 millimeter thick sheet of brass, and I'm marking how thick it needs to be not to interfere with the loop on the sheath, and then I cut it with a sheet cutting scissor, heavy duty scissor. And really 1 millimeter is too thick for this application. I should have gone for 0.5 millimeter instead. Would have been much easier to cut and to form. Well, it is what it is. So I cut this and then used my belt sander to trim off, to smooth out the edges so it has no sharp edges left and is nice and smooth. Then it's time to bend it into shape. If I had gone for the 0.5 millimeter thin sheet metal, I could have bent this reasonably by hand, maybe with pliers and a few tools, maybe a round pipe or piece of wood to bend this around. But as it is, I took the 1 millimeter thick sheet metal, and it was a pain to bend into shape, and I used hammers and everything at my disposal to finally get it in shape. And once I was satisfied with how the mouthpiece fit on the sheath, it was time to drill in some holes to attach it with some hollow rivets. 4 holes on each side, keeping the metal together and also securing it to the leather. Once again, had I done this with the 0.5 millimeter thick metal, this would have been so much easier, and I could probably have foregone the rivets altogether and just glued it to the leather. So rough up the surface of the leather and the metal, make sure it's free of any dust or grease by cleaning it with alcohol or cleaning gasoline, and then glue it on with something like Patex or my beloved Kevlar glue meant for gluing shoes together. And that would have been so much easier than drilling this and getting this rivets in. This was challenging. This was frustrating. This took me so long. So long, in fact, that I forgot to show the rest of the build, forgot to film it. But I basically attached a leather loop that wraps around the sheath, goes through the sewn-on loop, and then this leather strap that is just decorative that wraps around there. But yeah, goes in and out nice and smooth, and this finishes the build. Time to reposition the camera and film the intro of this episode. As always, thanks for watching and goodbye.